Thank you. Well, yeah, I hope Jillian is going to show up anyways. I'm very happy to have these wonderful ladies with me on stage. I'll just introduce them very quickly to those of you who don't know them yet. So we have Anita, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Mannheim, and her research focuses, among other things, on the dynamics of state repression and human rights, like how they inflict on human rights, and she uses statistical methods to estimate political and hidden forms of violence. There comes Jillian, and like she really, like, if you want to read research that's really methodologically sound, then look into what she's doing. And she's also having a talk later on stage too, at 5:30. So go check that out because it's really amazing work. And just to have an idea of what she's doing, she asks questions like, what's the influence of network disruptions, for instance, on the conflict in Syria? And she also published an op-ed in the Washington Post, which was entitled, When Internet Access Becomes a Weapon. So that's just an idea of what she does. Then we have Becky. Becky works for Tactical Tech, and she researches digital security and information management strategies. And the main thing is she also does a lot of workshops and trainings on the issue. And she's been researching lately with human rights, like she's been working with human rights defenders and trying to find out how to improve training and how to engage them and how to actually make these things sustainable. She's going to talk more about that later. It's amazing work, like really, really curious to hear about this. Jillian, who's super busy with 3 talks today, exactly. So most people probably know her. She works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In her take on this session of why I wanted to have these 3 people on board is because she works on free expression a lot, and she speaks out about surveillance and censorship, and she's been working on the role of social media and the ethics on algorithms lately, which I think is super fascinating. So we do have like the research on conflict, and we do have the practical side, and we do have the free expression, which I think to the topic we're talking about, which is like the next issue on the political agenda, cybersecurity, is a fascinating take. Because to me, working in the Foreign Office, I felt like the debate has kind of been changing. In 2014, after the first Snowden revelations, it was all about internet governance. Like it kind of seemed as if political decision makers were like, oh, well, there is this thing, this space that we don't really know what to do with, and it's gotten kind of out of control. So what do? How do we regulate this? How do we govern the space? And how do we kind of regain control? The thing was that for me in 2014, it was more about community involvement and trying to have different stakes, different parties, different groups try to participate. So we had processes like the Net Mondial conference, and we started the IANA transition process, and there was the ICANN accountability and all these kind of things. But kind of like trying to get away from state and intelligence controlled spaces to more inclusive participation. But right now, it feels like this is changing, and the debate is more focusing on cybersecurity. So the trend for 2015 is cybersecurity, and I wonder why that is. And that's a question I want to ask the panelists as well. Like, is it because processes like Net Mondial have failed? Or is it more that, on the contrary, traditionally more intergovernmental fields are actually now becoming more inclusive and different stakeholders get a say? And I will just going to give Jillian the first word because she came in last, so that's their punishment. There you go.
Thank you, and my apologies for running in like that. So I think, to get to that question, I'm just going to use a brief recent story as metaphor. So I went to the global conference on cyberspace in The Hague last month, and we joked that where cyberspace is actually spelled Security. And I arrived on the first day, went to take a nap, and woke up to find that my door was wide open, and there were police going up and down the hallway, and they had just left my door open, either assuming that I wasn't there or whatever, total invasion of privacy. And when I spoke to the hotel and spoke to the conference about this, the organizers of the conference were actually quite nice. I don't want to blame the Dutch government necessarily for this one. But when I spoke to the hotel, they said, oh, there are very important people staying here. We have to check the rooms for security. And I said, I'm speaking at this conference and I'm staying in this hotel. What do you mean by important people? Clearly not me. And I said story as metaphor because that was really the tone of the entire conference. It was an us versus them, where they are governments, we're people. It was cybersecurity for for police, for governments, but not for the people. And I think that that's really the trend that we're facing now. A lot of the way that the internet governance space has shifted is toward these government conferences where only respectable civil society is invited and allowed to participate. And I'm sure I won't be invited back next year. And I've seen other people get disinvited too for being a little too outspoken. And I think that that's what the governments at this point are kind of trying to do, is push us out and make these decisions for us.
Do you want to pass the mic to Anita, because she actually has a different stake on from the academia side, looking at it a little different, before I answer as a government representative to this critique.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm really happy to be on this panel. So the main research that I do is on state repression, and what we basically try to find out is how governments use different forms of repression against their own citizens. And this traditionally includes things such as torture and disappearances and killings, extrajudicial killings. But it also includes things such as censorship and surveillance now more and more. What Jillian just describes horrifying, but it's not surprising from a repression research point of view, because I think one of the few things that research on repression has shown us is that one of the best indicators for when governments will start acting like that is when they feel threatened. And that can have lots of different reasons, but the main reason why governments will start using such tactics, and they vary those tactics. We talk of repertoires of repression, and I think it's really interesting to see how the cybersecurity debate has changed these repertoires of repression. But the fundamental reason why these things happen hasn't really changed, and that is, being threatened of collective mobilization coming from below, basically.
Sure, so I'll provide also a slightly different perspective. So I do work for a civil society organization. Tactical Technology Collective has been working for over a decade now, mostly in contexts outside of Europe and the United States and Canada. So with human rights defenders in fairly repressive environments. And during this time, we have experienced something that is sometimes called securitization, which we'll talk more about later. But it's this idea that over time, things seem to become more and more about security. And as soon as they do, the discussion kind of shuts down a bit. And so our role then, because we do work together with different groups and communities who are facing quite concrete harms from something that is considered abstract, actually, it forces us to start from a different place and actually ask what security means. So whereas right now we're noticing a debate that's framed around cybersecurity, and it's very specific, and there's a very specific discourse behind it, we find that in order to actually help people respond in a practical way, the first thing you have to do is dismantle the discourse and start by asking what security actually means to you and to your community and to your group. And when we do that, we find that it means very different things depending on context. And so as we observe these kind of higher level policy things happen, we also observe how they quite concretely affect communities of human rights workers and human rights defenders, and how they then have to work to break apart this discourse and actually make it support their human rights.
Thanks for that. Like, for me, what I hear out of this is kind of like, yes, there is kind of a security trend. And the other thing is, who are the actors? Like, who's talking to whom, and who is affected by that kind of conversation and the measures that are taken up? And the other thing is, like, this label, cybersecurity, obviously is already a term that kind of goes into a political discussion, because I think most of you actually use digital security or InfoSec. And maybe we can also go into this, apart from talking about who are the actors and who are actually the communities who are talking or not talking and should be engaging, and who's putting which pressure on what, is also a question like, which terms do we use, and why maybe do we use different terms? Whoever wants to start, right? Becky is already nodding, so I'm just going to pass it right back to you already.
Sure. So we do use the word digital security. In fact, Tactile Tech has a slogan. It said, "Digital security is possible." And basically what this means is security is a process, and along the way you have to figure out what it means. And I think that historically we have used the word digital it's been interesting to watch cyber kind of like, I mean, it was around in the 90s, then it disappeared for a while, and then it came back to with a vengeance to the point that it's kind of part of everything now. Yeah, and actually information security is a word that you hear so often still in communities of different hackers, different IT professionals who are working on security at a organizational or institutional level. And so I guess the question for us is what does happen when everything does fall under this umbrella of cyber? For now we're sticking with digital, although we also have a methodology called holistic security, which attempts to understand actually how security, basically it's not confined to the digital space, it's not confined to this thing we call cyberspace, which I'm still not sure what that is, because anything you do has an impact in real space. We are still embodied people, even if we are using technology. So I'm not sure what cyberspace is, and I'm not sure what cybersecurity is.
If I may add to that, because the term information security in the political discourse that I work in usually is actually heavily loaded, because it usually means that with regard to surveillance, you also read the content. So like information means you don't just have the metadata, you actually do look into content. So like it's really, really heavily politically loaded. And there's kind of a clash between the tech community then, which say like, well, information security is kind of better than cyber because whatever is cyber. And we do have this cyber or hyper cyber, whatever you want to call it, debate. But that's like, you know, where do you have that clash? And where's the rhetorics that we might need to kind of try and work our way around it? I'm not sure if you want to comment on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing this, and I absolutely agree with what Becky just said, but I'm also kind of recalling a couple years ago when there was this warning of a cyber Pearl Harbor. Do you remember that? That's the level of discourse we're at. Cyber, you know, and we actually made T-shirts that said Cyber Vesuvius, you know, just to really bring it home. But I think, you know, that's the rhetoric of governments, and I'm sorry to do that again, but particularly, let's say my government, for that matter. The rhetoric of governments has become this, you know, we're under threat, you're the threat. And it might not be you, but it's nevertheless us, not them, that is considered the threat. And so when they're talking at this level, it feels sort of like security for me, not for thee.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with what Jillian said. I think if we look at, if we go a little further back in time before the internet, and look at how governments framed justified the use of repression in autocratic and also in democratic countries, we see how just, you know, the name has changed. It used to be the threat of the left, and then it was threat of terrorism, and now we see that lots of governments use the threat coming from the cyber world, whatever that might be. Cyber terrorists, which are people living in the cyberspace, I guess. It's really useful for governments who want to stay in power to find something that is abstract enough to invoke fear in the majority of the population, or at least in a sufficient amount of the population, so as to still kind of rally enough support for the measures that they're using. And generally, and the nice thing about cybersecurity for governments now is that it not only is an abstract term that can be used, but it's also a way that information, as you said, can be controlled, and the discourse can be shaped as well. So.
That's actually a very important point, which leads directly to the next question that I had. It's kind of, if cyberspace is now this abstract term that we can use to securitize rhetoric and kind of the political discourse, and something, as you said, has happened before cyberspace as well. Before we had the internet, there was already this process, or we use it in terrorism, it doesn't matter. So there's always this trend of securitization, which kind of is something that governments might use to control the space. But how do we react to this? Like, if we have this discourse, what's the next term that we're going to use if we do kind of find something to describe this as cyberspace to us, or we use this term, or define it in a different way, then what's going to be the next word? So kind of how do you react to this trend, and what do you do with this process of securitization? Because it's really, really something that we do have in a lot of things that are happening right now, whether it's the data retention debate, whether it's the new anti-terrorist laws, or whether it's, I don't know, the front or back doors to encryption. There's so many things happening where this is used. So how do we actually answer to this? What's going to be the reply, and like, how do we find strategies to work with this?
It is a difficult question. She just whispered that. Yeah, no, I mean, I think one thing. I'll give one answer, not the whole answer, because I'm sure that you guys have great insight into this as well. I think that we have to stop treating cyberspace or the internet or the digital sphere as a separate universe. If you look at like the cybercrime bills that are coming out of places like Pakistan and Egypt, and frankly, for that matter, the West, what we're seeing is criminal penalties that are higher for crimes committed online versus those committed offline. And this has been a trend for some time, but it's particularly just in the past month, Tanzania, Egypt, and Pakistan all came out with new bills. And I think that when we do that, when we treat cyberspace, or the, God, whatever, we'll just say cyberspace, when we treat that as if it's an entirely parallel universe, we're buying into that rhetoric, that discourse that I think just makes literally zero sense.
So I can just explain this process that I guess we sometimes call contextualizing security. So I've been working on a research project called Security in Context, and basically I think the idea has always been to basically pull out the meaning from, I don't want to say from the ground, but from where the work is happening and from where the greatest harms are being experienced. And so when you talk about context, that can mean many different things. It's about geography, it's about culture, languages that are spoken, what kinds of workflows people have, so what kind of tools are essential to their work, what kinds of vulnerabilities are they experiencing. And when you put all of this together, you discover that, for example, you might learn that one specific group really needs to maintain malleable identities online, because when they're forced to use a specific legal name or a specific name that relates back to other forms of identification, they actually then experience violence. And this violence can be tied back to different forms of harassment that they experience online as well. Another example would be a human rights defender might want to use encryption, but it might be illegal in their country to do so. And so if we're talking about the importance of encryption, then the question of what exposure means for people who use these kinds of tools becomes important. So the priority then becomes, well, how do we actually enable people to be able to pursue digital security in a particular place and a particular time? So yeah, I'm going to go with contextualization for now as a strategy forward.
I think violence was kind of your keyword, where you can probably jump in a certain way too.
Yeah, I think one important way to make this debate kind of resonate with larger public interest is to kind of tie it to concrete things that are happening to people. So taking it away, as you said, from this like cyberspace is somewhere else. It's actually something we all spend time on the internet and basically show how it affects our everyday life. And one way that I've been trying to do that in my research is seeing how different forms of cyber controls that are being used actually go hand in hand with government repression. And by government repression here, I mean physical repression. So people are being killed, people are being targeted for certain identities, or people are just being killed at random. And what we see, for example, in the Syrian conflict, where I've been doing most of my research, is that where the government decides to seemingly provide internet access to its population, meaning that it has the opportunity to use all kinds of spyware and all kinds of surveillance techniques, we see a much higher prevalence of targeted killing. So we see more people who are being detained, we're seeing more people who are being tortured and then being killed, we're seeing more people who are being executed directly. And at the same time, where the government shuts down the internet completely, we see more people who are being targeted in a large-scale way. So here, basically, the effects of how the internet is available or not directly impacts people's lives. And I think that can also be drawn to less crass context than in Syria, but kind of tying the effects of these cybersecurity bills to the human rights discourse, for example, is really something that I think brings home the idea of it's not just some kind of space out there, it affects our everyday life.
That was going to be my takeaway from both what you said. Like, it seems like to get away from this, the focus should be on human rights. Like, is this the link that we can use to say we have to rethink this? And the debate is only like in its beginnings, because in the like internet governance used to be like, oh yeah, it's about freedom online, it's about human rights online, etc. But having this cybersecurity debate kind of going all over the place, maybe what you have to do and what like should be the message is kind of strengthening this human rights aspect. The question is, does that also mean that we're kind of fueling this debate of cybersecurity? Like, should we go away from it and just say human rights, or should we try to bring the human rights aspect into the debate? I think that's kind of something we also need to consider. Do you want to start? I can also give the word to Becky if you don't want to do it.
So I don't see human rights as separate from security simply because of what we do. I mean, basically, sometimes the only way you can exercise your human rights is by using a specific privacy-enhancing technology, form of encryption that will provide you the assurance that something that you need kept private and confidential will actually be kept confidential. And I mean, this could be seen as a problem in itself, that the only way to exercise a right is by using this tool. But on the other hand, that shouldn't mean that we end up criminalizing tools or making them harder to use. That means that we need to basically support the ecosystem of supports that allow us to actually live human rights as opposed to simply talking about them.
So for your work, you basically need the resources to do actually this training and the contextualization, and I guess resources is also an issue probably in academia if you want to strengthen this, if I may pass this on to Anita.
Sure. I think more research on how different forms of cybersecurity bills, for example, what we're seeing right now, are tied to larger movements within countries, is something that really kind of openly demonstrates what direction governments are going in with their bills. The inclusion of cybersecurity in more kind of large-scale quantitative repression research, which is basically the field that I work in, is relatively new. And what we see is that everyone in state repression research thought, well, this is going to be great. The internet is going to help us, and it's going to show us that we have a general trend of democratization in the world, and so on and so forth. And what we actually see is the opposite. We see that governments that have made use or have allowed a large proportion of their population to access the internet are much more stable in securing that power. And I think this is something that really impressively shows that it really depends on what happens now in terms of the effect that the internet can have. And again, I don't know if this really has to be discussed within the context of the cybersecurity discourse, but I think tying it to things such as democratization and just durability of autocratic regimes really kind of makes the point that this is something that affects more policy spaces.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of you guys now mention cybercrime bills, and that they all seem to be kind of coming in around the same time, or being test-driven in different kinds of ways in different countries. And that's definitely something that we saw reflected back to us just through practical work of teaching digital security strategies, teaching privacy strategies in different contexts. A lot of people, a lot of human rights defenders are extremely concerned in different countries throughout Asia and Africa, and they all notice that these bills are coming in, and often the language is copy and pasted. It might be from a regional neighbor who holds kind of the prevailing influence in that area, and so then that language gets copy-pasted. The bill gets put together in an opaque way that doesn't engage civil society. But then what civil society does see is all of a sudden bloggers are getting arrested, people who seem to simply be working on democratization efforts, And this is a huge cause for concern, and it causes them to want to find constructive responses to preserve their human rights then in response to something that is probably one of the more prominent parts of cybersecurity as a agenda right now. Cybercrime is a huge part of that. So it seems to be in contradiction a bit.
There's not much that I can add to all of that, but I guess the one thing that I would say is, once in a while, working in other parts of the world, you get, calls for let's bring it more local, let's have trainers from our country, let's do this, let's whatever, kind of a localization of context. And I think what often gets forgotten there is that all of our governments are cooperating with each other, so we should be as well.
That's definitely a good point, because the other thing is when I hear that, is like, are we still balancing freedom and security, or should this be the same? What's the discourse? And then also this, when I come to balancing security and freedom, which is also tied to all those cybercrime bills and all the other legislation and the political discourse, I wonder, given that there's 2 Americans and 2 Germans on stage, should we also talk about the transatlantic relationship? Because I have a feeling that the debate might be going in different directions, or not. It depends on which way you look at it, I guess. I'm just going to pass back to Jillian for this one.
I don't have much to say because my organization's been left out of that. So
Give me a personal opinion.
I think that, oh God, personal opinion. I'm gonna have to pass. I just don't have much there, sorry.
Well, I can talk a bit about this. We've all been wondering what kind of awareness the Snowden leaks, revelations, documents, whatever this process has been, what kind of awareness has that really brought up among civil society, among governments, among all those stakeholders? And for a little while there was a sense of optimism that this would cause governments to, well, outside of the US, to perhaps question the direction that the surveillance was taking and how many resources they were putting into creating extremely pervasive and invasive systems. But unfortunately, we've been hearing back from so-called repressive environments that when a group of people see that these capabilities exist, they want them too. It's like it's a copycat effect in a way. It's like, oh wow, those guys have a really great toy. We want that toy too. So when that happens, you end up seeing that within a couple years, even in a country that might still be described as, oh, it's still a developing nation, they don't have much infrastructure, they're still working on access to the internet. A lot of the time, the harms might come much sooner than anyone thinks because first of all, they see the toy, they want it, and then a big regional ally might give them the toy because that way they get access to a lot more data than they would have otherwise. Now they can monitor the countries around them as well. And this is something that we've observed concretely. So yeah, I think what we're seeing is a copycat effect because you see a shiny new thing and you want it too, and that's a human thing, I guess.
So instead of best practices, we're talking copycat then?
Yeah, I think so, unfortunately.
And Anita, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, just briefly. I think I can second that, and I think that diffusion of different repertoires of repression, as we might call it, is something that we've seen before this. The types of torture that are mostly used nowadays, forms of torture where you don't see scars, is something that was predominantly developed by democratic countries because it's much easier to plausibly deny what you've done. Now this is something that non-democratic countries have taken on as well. They're like, hey, that's a good idea. Why not copy that as well? And I think that's something, with the Snowden revelations, that was also a way to demonstrate to other governments, hey, look, as you said, these are tools that we have and these are things that we're capable of, and you might want them too. So I think we're seeing a lot of diffusion on this topic. Yeah.
And since we've digressed a little bit away from the transatlantic dialogue, I'll just add to that and say that one of the things that I found really troubling at that conference that I mentioned earlier it was in translation, so I'm not sure how accurate the translation was, but the Chinese government saying, let's all hold hands and work together to police the internet. And the Western governments lapping it right up, more than happy to work with China when it's convenient for them, but then condemn them with the other hand. And I just find it appalling. I find the entire thing appalling.
Given that, like, this is actually quite a depressing debate, and it was like supposed to be, you know, what are the positive takeaways and what can we do in 2015? So I kind of wonder if, because going back to the transatlantic relationship, media reactions have been very, very different. And I wonder, is that just because the media works differently, or is it because the population actually has a different stake on certain issues? Like, is privacy really seen differently in Germany than it is in the US? Or is it just the coverage that, like, press has a different standing? Like, what's the issue on this? Because I really think that this also influences the debate a lot, especially when I see GCCS and the way it's been received in the media. It was like, it was this huge success, and a lot of things that actually happened or did not work out, or were like really not going the way they were planned, were completely lost in the media coverage. It was just not there. So I wonder, like, should that have been like received more attention, or what was the issue on this one? So like going into the media space and trying to find out like how do journalists work and how does the population react to this issue might be a point too.
I mean, I think privacy is different in the US and Germany. I've been living here for about 8 months, and one of the things that I noticed, actually somebody else pointed it out to me, I can't take credit for this one, but toilets in the US, public toilets, the door comes to about here, and in Germany it comes all the way to the ground. And there are parts of the world where everyone goes together without doors. So I do think that privacy definitely differs by culture. There's obviously personal context to it as well, but the coverage, the media coverage, as a non-German reader, but nevertheless, is significantly different. I think that, you know, in the terms of that conference, I saw, yeah, it's only glowing and horrifying articles. There was nothing in the middle, nothing nuanced. I don't know what to say to that. But I do think that that the media, I think for a point of optimism, I do think that the media coverage of these topics is getting better in a lot of ways. We're asking, or journalists are asking questions that weren't being asked a few years ago. They're working with security researchers or experts in ways that they weren't. And I think that all of that is positive.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of bits about the cultural relativity of privacy. So it's definitely there. In a way, yes, of course, wherever you go, the culture, the infrastructure, the resources will dictate how people feel about their space and how people feel about their boundaries. On the other hand, what's always present is that people do always care about respect for boundaries. Whether they decide that something is confidential, every single culture in the world cares about keeping certain things confidential. And so in that way, you discover that privacy is present everywhere. And in terms of media coverage, I think definitely Germany has done a rather thorough job of going through, well, since the summer of 2013, looking at surveillance. And maybe this is part of kind of a European attitude that has a different take on privacy. In the US, you find that most of the time the focus is on the individual, and that so privacy becomes something that an individual takes care of. They go hide in a cave somewhere, and that's like the ultimate notion of privacy. And the result of that is then that you have companies who build their entire cultures around this notion that the only way you can be private is alone. And then as a consequence of that, sharing information is seen as the opposite of privacy. And if people don't share information, then we don't have the internet can't stop running anymore, or the internet can't run the way it should. This becomes the argument. And so I think that in the US, there's still a huge emphasis on individualism as it pertains to privacy, and that impacts the tools we use, the regulation that we get in many different kinds of the world, and I think that that's something that historically Europe has done a better job with, but Europe and the US are quite interdependent in many different ways, and so there's a lot more critical thinking that needs to be done, even if in a way certain things are respected here slightly differently than in the US.
Just the German voice.
Well, I'm not a media expert, and I don't want to talk for the German media. But I do think two things that we do observe in the coverage of cybersecurity issues is, number one, it's still a very abstract topic. And for people attending Republica, maybe that's not the case. But if you talk to everyday people, whatever everyday people might be, if you talk to people who don't think about this 24 hours a day, they often have a very different, very simple take on it, and that is, does it really harm me in the end? And are they really going to find my needle in the haystack, and how important is that? And I think the media has done a really good job at kind of making it clear how this does impact us, but at the same time, the problem is so big that then it feels insurmountable, and then you see that people just get, resignated about it. So I think that's a really big problem in mobilizing people to kind of engage with the topic.
Absolutely, I can agree more. Which kind of brings me to another tool which might help or might not. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about it. It's the new Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. Is this going to help with the debate? Is there, do you think there's going to be positive outcomes from this? Is it going to be more influential on the legal level in actually finding out what proportional is? Or is it more on the political level in kind of stirring the debate and drawing more attention to the topic? What do you think?
So I don't know how familiar everyone here is with the Special Rapporteur, but the previous one, the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and privacy. Freedom of expression. Okay, right. So this is, yes, sorry. Whew, bearings. So the previous Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression was amazing, and I think really furthered that particular debate. I think that there's an opportunity for that, but I honestly can't say that I've seen any candidates so far that will do a good job.
I mean, I think it's a tool in our toolbox, although sometimes people say, there's more practical things you can do, then there's the policy things. I don't see it as like a dichotomy between some people go train people to use PGP and other people go engage in high-level policy debates. I think that a great, strong rapporteur would help everything that we're doing, and we're seeing that right now with someone like Alan Kay, who is now making a strong push for the importance of encryption and in support of human rights. So,
do you want to comment, or?
Well, apart from who's going to be taking the office, I think just the fact that people have sat down and said, this is what we need, and we need someone to be doing this job, that can actually already have some kind of signaling power that can be important, even if it's not measurable in the same way as other things.
It's actually the first time that there's ever going to be a rapporteur on privacy. Before that, there was always freedom of expression, and other people just used their mandate to actually cover these aspects too. So we're going to see what's going to come out of this in June. But I do think that David Kay, especially with the encryption, might be something that we want to go into as well, because he also said that one of the next issues he's going to be talking about with freedom of expression is whistleblowing, which is probably another topic which we could talk about when it comes to cybersecurity. I just want to say at this stage, if there's any questions from the audience, please raise your hand so we can take questions from the audience as well. Just if there's something that you feel we haven't covered at all. So we go a little on encryption and whistleblowing and how to actually, because that's also something, in Germany it's not regulated at all. There is no law for this. Do we need this? Is this a debate that should be part of the cybersecurity debate or not? Or is this really more the human rights perspective? And apart from that, I think something that we haven't mentioned at all is the role of corporate organizations and enterprises, especially if we look at social media and there's this whole algorithm thing, how does this impact it, and which role do actually companies have when it comes to cybersecurity is another topic that we really should probably broach briefly. Not going to go first this time. All right, Becky. Sorry.
Okay, so encryption. Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm sorry, can you prompt me again? Where are we now with encryption specifically?
It's basically the whole debate of having legislation on encryption, okay. And how do we go forward? Because we have the tools, but there is laws coming out on this that are limiting it. At the same time, we advocate on certain efforts. And another question is because David Kay is going to put out the report of how this actually, if we limit the use of encryption, we're actually also inflicting on our human rights a lot. And that's going to be the aspect he's going to bring out in whistleblowing as well.
So there's many sides to this, but there's two main ones, which is from where we're coming from, which is, first of all, everyone should be able to use encryption if they want to. The reality is that when you're building a strategy for privacy or security, if you're in a place where certain rights aren't supported, then then you have to take into consideration whether using encryption is really going to give you the result you want, because you might encrypt something and then someone's office will still get busted in and all of their information will be stolen and they might end up in prison. So, encryption can't solve everything on its own. And so then what we try to understand is what's actually necessary for people to be able to use it at all, because even though encryption is available, most people, when it's left to the level of an individual practice, which requires you to install particular kinds of tools and go through a series of processes, most people don't end up actually carrying that out. It's a bit different when it's at an infrastructure level, which is probably a separate conversation. But if this problem arrives at a person's computer and then they now need to do something, we find that it becomes a very intensive process when working with people who really, really have a high desire to learn, all of the motivations because they're facing concrete harms in their environment. They have every reason to want to use this. Surveillance is not abstract to them. And they still have difficulties. And a lot of that ultimately becomes, what we're finding now is that this really boils down to resources and social structures around this person. So this gets me back to my rant about American notions of privacy being individual. So if you are an individual and you want to use encryption in your communications, you need someone else in order to do it with. And it's actually incredibly hard to find tools that make this like a feasible process for people unless they have been sitting there working on it in a training for 5 days, which is what we try to do. And even after that training, it's a problem, and that's because there aren't enough resources to continue to learn and to continue to practice these things. So what we really come down to ultimately is we need more resources in order to build more sustainable strategies that start with communities and groups so that people can even exercise their human rights through the use of encryption in the first place.
So it's basically about individual empowerment and having the resources to allow for that, basically.
I think I absolutely agree with that, and I think using encryption, using privacy-enhancing technologies is one of the only ways that we can take individual responsibility. And I agree, I have a lot of problems with the American conception of privacy, but nevertheless, that's still the one thing that you can do individually. Everything else, every other solution, and believe me, I think that we should approach this from all angles, but every other solution to this problem requires some sort of collective responsibility or collective work, whereas encryption is absolutely, and well, I guess you're right, not particularly individual, but individual in a different sense. Individual as opposed to broadly collective responsibility.
Question for me, if I may just interact on this one, is if we promote encryption and we have places like Cuba where it's completely illegal and you actually do go to jail for quite a long time, or in Egypt, it's like, how do we help those people then? How do we empower them? What's the message that we send out to actually, with regard to security, how do you defend yourself if that's where we're going? Because if we're talking individual empowerment to kind of change the discourse, is there a solution to this? Or is that the reason why it's actually taking to the government level? Because there's you have to kind of influence the legislation, which is not going to happen from an individual person.
I once incited a room full of people to commit a crime in Egypt without that's why I mentioned it. I didn't know that encryption was illegal there, and I was speaking in Cairo to a large audience and was telling everyone to use encryption. Somebody came up to me after and was like, yeah, so that's illegal. And I probably wouldn't have said the same things that I said knowing that, just for personal risk. But I think, fine, then it's an act of civil disobedience, and I will still encourage it. I would love it if this new push for cybersecurity was ultimately about making individual level digital security more feasible. So sure, the optimistic side of me thinks that all of this money being spent right now on beautiful conferences to figure out what cybersecurity is will ultimately get channeled into enabling more people to use it because the politicians and the legislators and the regulators and the company representatives are obviously sitting there and hashing out how to make it possible for people in Cuba to finally use these tools. So that's my optimistic
Yay.
Yay.
Just to be a little more pessimistic on that note. I think obviously there should be the individual right for everyone to use encryption tools as they please, but before the internet and before we used encryption, governments were kicking in doors and raiding offices, and Germany has a great history of surveillance predating the internet. So I think there are lots of other ways in which governments can still do that, and even if the message is encrypted, that might actually be enough reason to go and investigate. So it's a political question in the end, right? So it's both. It's giving people the opportunity to encrypt their information, but also encouraging a discourse where governments try to at least keep checks on each other in using this.
No, I was agreeing. I'm saying I hope that's what they were doing there. They were figuring out this political discourse. Yeah. Cool.
Before turning to the question of what's the role of companies in this when it comes to cybersecurity, are there questions from the floor that we should take on? And just signal there's a mic over there that we can pass around if someone has a question to the panel. I don't see any at the moment, so I'm just going to go to this aspect of, because corporations actually do have a lot of power when it comes to this cyberspace, whatever it is. So how do we actually engage them? Should we engage them in different, because now we've been talking about governments and not doing the right things, or over-regulating, or being powerless, whatever, and individual empowerment. But there is this actor that is super influential. So what do they actually do when it comes to cybersecurity, or what should they be doing, and what could be a take on this? And I'm going to pass it to Jillian because she's been working on ethics, on algorithms, so she probably do, and social media a lot, so she probably does have a very interesting take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just did the interview with the Google VP of Security and Engineering too, so I've got some new thoughts. No, I think that a lot of my work is really critical of companies and the ways in which they control our social spaces online, and that primarily has to do with censorship. This is a separate issue. I think that in this area, companies can absolutely be positive actors. I mean, they're not necessarily doing so at the moment, but I think that there's a place for us to encourage them to be positive actors in building a more secure internet. And I think, criticize Google all you want, but they've put millions of dollars into doing that, doing just that. And I think in some ways, despite the NSA, let's put that to the side for a moment, and despite their potential collaboration with them, they've nevertheless set an example for other companies. Other companies know now that they have to do that. Not all of them are, and Google's not doing everything right. I'm not a Google fangirl, but I do think that we have these big companies setting a solid example for smaller ones that could potentially be positive if we encourage it.
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating to watch all of the companies in the last couple of years who have decided that loss of trust is ultimately harmful to their business model, and then that being a huge incentive to up the ante on their best practices and their infrastructure. I think also that working on infrastructure at a deeper level in terms of protocols and encryption, making that more pervasive throughout internet infrastructure is also crucial, which hopefully companies can engage in that process as well in moving that forward with engineers. There's a part of this where sometimes I hear people talk about making systems secure against human error, and this is a language that comes up a lot in different kinds of security discourse, which is like, oh, well, a person is the weakest link in the system, how do we guard against their mistakes? And I find that, unfortunately, that attitude that the person is the cause of the problem, or the user, the everyday user, the average user, this kind of perpetuates a state of disempowerment among people. They begin to feel like there's nothing they can do that will actually help. And they also end up feeling like it's then entirely up to the companies to take care of things. And so we just like to emphasize that it's very important to start from the person's own priorities and understand how they themselves are using a technology, and that plays a very important role in making digital security ultimately feasible. Yeah.
Do companies play a role in your research? Because you focus on conflict, do you kind of take a look at this too, or is that something that's basically not part of the debate there?
Well, a large part of repression or conflict literature is looking at companies that provide tools that are needed for repression. And back in the olden days, that was small arms, that was different types of tanks that governments need, and so on and so forth. And I think we can add companies that provide governments or sell surveillance software to governments to this list, and I think research on this field is growing, but it needs to be expanded, definitely.
Yeah. There's a question in the audience.
Okay, actually,
afterwards, there's another one here.
Sorry, yeah, that's actually the question I was going to ask right now about companies that are providing that surveillance software to these repressive regimes, and Syria and Egypt came up, and been on the receiving end of both of those, and I just want to hear more about. It feels from our side like a bunch of hypocrisy, where the Western governments are like, they're repressive regimes, but they allow these companies emerging from their countries to sell, and we're just sitting looking at this in complete disbelief, and we just want to know just your take on this.
So basically a question about export control, I guess. Who wants to answer that one first?
Well, I think it's a pattern that we see that's repeating itself. I mean, Germany is one of the biggest arms exporters. We make a lot of money on this, and I think there's no reason to assume why it should be different in the field of surveillance technology. It might even be a little less obvious to the public why this should be a problem, especially if it's sold not in the intent of surveilling protesters, but surveilling, giving this type of software to the police, for example. So absolutely, I think we need to have a much bigger debate on export controls in this area as well. But I'm not surprised that we're not seeing it.
I haven't worked on this issue for about a year, so I'm way behind in terms of trends in export controls, unfortunately, so I can't give the solid answer. But just to sort of take a step back and look at the problem more broadly, I think what we've got is a really hypocritical situation, and a lot of the earlier solutions to this were to put countries in good and bad categories. Bad countries do this, good countries do this, and it's okay to sell to those, but not to those. I don't think that that's the way things are going anymore, and I'm grateful for that, but the reason, of course, being the reason that that's a problem being the fact that, Western countries torture too. I think that, again, I wish I could comment on the current state of export controls. There are a lot of people here who can, and I'll introduce you to them. I absolutely think that this is one of the biggest problems that we have right now in this space.
Well, Kathleen, if I may, because as a matter of fact, I'm on the board with Reporters Reporters Without Borders, the German section, and we've been running a campaign against the export of surveillance technology for several years in coalition with a bunch of international NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Privacy International, Amnesty International, and others. And we have seen some effects, to say the least, because I won't go into details because this is a different discussion here, but there is an international agreement that's called the Vasana agreement that looks into export controls for dual-use goods, and these kinds of software were added to that protocol. So in many countries that have signed on to this agreement, it is now mandatory to ask for export permissions if you want to export this software. Now there's of course a huge debate about how effective that is. That's always the case when you're talking about controlling exports of any kind of weaponry or software in that case. But of course, especially if we're looking at the Western countries, the companies who work there usually have a high incentive to not break the law. Of course, we all know that there are companies that break the law, but they do have to face severe repercussions if they are caught, right? So at least it's a first step, and some governments are more cooperative than others. And right now there's a new initiative to add this kind of technology, this surveillance technology, to I don't know the exact term in English, but a torture agreement on the European Union level, which would add another layer of control and opportunity to at least have some means to limit the export of that software, at least from Western countries who we still believe have some incentive to abide by the law of their country, right? Okay, so much for that. Sorry for...
No, thanks for the addition.
Actually, thanks for the addition, because my question sort of taps into that. So, first of all, thanks a lot. It's an amazing panel. My question is, how efficient are governments and laws anyway with what we see, for example, with Max Schrems and what he does with Europe versus Facebook, which we see that actually a lot of these companies are anyway processing and then sort of, moving our data from place to place. So it also breached data protection, it also breached safe harbor. So what is, the efficiency of these kind of agreements, like you said as well, if they are actually there, but they're not really being enforced? A lot of companies are signing this safe harbor and say, oh, we're not going to move this data, but they're actually doing it. So I wanted to hear your take on it in terms of cybersecurity as well. If we're going to have laws, how effective might they be if they're already not being respected?
I laughed because we talked earlier about topics that we're not going to touch on. Safe harbor was one of them because we were we could play bingo, which phrases should we probably drop. Safe harbor we agreed not to have, but that's fine because that's a better question. How do we actually implement the agreements that we have? It's the same problem with Vasana because there's also some actually issues with dual-use technologies because encryption is on there too. So it's kind of you have to find a way of how to implement that effectively, which is a valid question. I don't know if you have a personal take on that.
I'll just give a quick one. I think that I think we can look to what has been tried already and what doesn't work in terms of keeping companies accountable for their actions. I think the Global Network Initiative, for example, is something you could point to as a massive failure, in my opinion. I think that they haven't kept companies from censoring out of line. I've got a call with Microsoft Bing this week. It turns out they're still censoring in the Middle East without any government asking them to do so. So keeping companies responsible or keeping them accountable to their constituents, to their users, is hard even when there are laws in place. And I think that we need to look for innovative solutions to that. But if I had the answer, I'd be a millionaire.
Well, maybe I'll just briefly come back to securitization as a topic, because a lot of the time, well, it's one of the things that may make a law fail ultimately, where an effort around Vasana fail, is when the security argument comes in, unfortunately, ironically. If that comes in, then if someone says the word national, or the words national security, that tends to override almost any other rationalization, sometimes even human rights, although there has been good progress recently to better document the harms to human rights that happen when these arguments around security occur. So I think the key is to make sure that any further discussion around security be a constructive discussion rather than one that shuts everything else down, basically.
Since we're running out of time, unless Anita, you want to add on this, I would ask the last question of each of the panelists, what's the main challenge for you in 2015, the next segment, and what should be tackled first, in what would you suggest would be, how can we influence this challenge that you identify in a positive way? Just to end on a positive note.
Keep making sure that the people, the users, are secure. Making sure that people understand, and we can, what's the right word? Making sure that users understand digital security for themselves. If companies and governments have it, then we need to step it up too.
Okay, two positive points from the research perspective. I think the first positive point is there's a lot of pessimism around international agreements, and I think rightly so. A lot of research shows that they don't immediately work, but then there's newer research that actually says it doesn't work immediately, but it does somehow put something out there that can hold governments accountable ultimately. So I think not totally giving up hope on these kind of international agreements might actually be quite good. And then secondly, if we look at more closely how governments are using cyber security selectively in their policies, we see that they're using it when they get really scared, right? And they're scared because obviously something's happening. People are using, for example, social media to actually mobilize against the government, and governments are scared of that. So I think the fact that this is the response that we're seeing is because obviously something is happening. So I think there's a positive twist in there somewhere.
I guess the positive twist for us as people who work on capacity building, in other words, trying to build constructive, appropriate responses to big, scary problems, is that we found that actually when we get enough resources in order to work with communities over time, we find that that has a real effect. When we are able to train human rights defenders in a way that you're not just coming in for 5 days and then you have to go back and then you expect all of these people to understand the inner workings of digital security like, I don't know, one of the top experts in the world. Like, when we're not just limited to this tiny little artificial resource, great things can happen, and therefore I would just emphasize the importance of resources for education, but not just the kind of education where you get a public safety notice like beware of spam or beware of phishing. Like, it needs to be more substantive than that. So.
Thank you for that. I actually think that's a really great wrap-up of like, okay, if we want to tackle cybersecurity, we need to build capacity and like empower people. So I'm very happy, and thank you so much for joining me on stage. I really enjoyed it. I hope so you did you. I'm getting signals that we're supposed to end, so thanks everyone.
Yes.